continuação da leitura do livro The New Map. Essa leitura está em inglês. É o capítulo 2, Chapter 2, The Discovery of Shale Oil. One morning in 2007, Mark Papa was getting ready for a board meeting in Houston. He was the CEO of EOG, one of the leading independents in the Barnett Shale. Looking at the slides of how much gas EOG alone had found in the Barnett, his mind wandered down a troubling path. The magnitude was changing, Papa thought to himself. As a company, EOG used to think in terms of BCF, billions of cubic meters, or cubic feet, for its natural gas reserves. Now, with all its shale gas in the Barnett, it was talking about units 1,000 times larger, TCF trillions of cubic feet, and TCF until the Barnett was usually reserved for something like measuring the total gas reserves of the United States, not those of a single company. Other companies were finding similar amounts. Papa added up the numbers in his head. The result was alarming. This is going to affect the natural gas market, he realized. Papa had the slightly surprised look of a chemistry professor who had just realized he was late to teach his class. He had grown up outside Pittsburgh, and then, after coming across a brochure from an oil company, he decided to study petroleum engineering at the University of Pittsburgh. This will sound unscientific, he once said, but most of the areas where petroleum is found are relatively warm. I like warm. Over the course of his career, Papa had learned to keep an eye on the macro, the big picture, and he had once worked for an oil economist who closely followed OPEC and the fluctuations in the oil market. I learned that you'd better pay attention to supply and demand, said Papa. I love the supply-demand mechanism, the EBB and flow. Now, putting aside the slides he was reviewing, Papa visualized what the supply-demand mechanisms were saying. It was just absolutely obvious, he said. Gas is a commodity, and the gas price was going to fall like a rock, and we would be heavily impacted. EOG had only 3 options. It could go international, but then it would be competing against the likes of Exxon and Shell and BP, and that would be very tough, since EOG did not have the scale, resources, or experience. Or it could venture out into the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico, but it had no experience there. Or it could go where it did have some expertise, in shale, and see if it could extract oil from the dense rock as it did natural gas. But that would push Papa into a position similar to that faced by George Mitchell, climbing up a high wall of skepticism. Interested dogma, in EOG's words, flatly asserted that shale rock was too dense, even with fracturing, for oil to flow. According to that dogma, oil molecules were much larger than gas molecules, and thus would not be able to fit through the tiny pores that fracking would create in the rock. That was not the only reason for skepticism. There was also the almost universal conviction that America's day as a petroleum producer was fast ebbing away. By 2007, U.S. oil production would be down to 5.1 million barrels per day, little more than half of what it had been at the beginning of the 70s. Meanwhile, net oil imports had risen to almost 6% of consumption. Politicians may have promised energy independence, but the real question seemed to be at what rate imports would continue to rise. EOG needed to answer that specific question. Were oil molecules too big to flow through shale that had been fracked? They were clearly bigger than natural gas molecules. But how much bigger? Let's look it up, Papa announced. Surely there had to be some research papers. Yes, yet, strangely, the EOG team could find no research that quantified the size of an oil molecule. They would have to do the research themselves. How large was a natural gas molecule? How large was an oil molecule? And how big, before and after fracking, would be the pore spaces, the tiny spaces or holes invisible to the naked eye in the rock? After investigating the matter with electron microscopes and a CT scan and thin slices, of course, they had the answer, and oil molecule was anywhere from slightly bigger than a gas molecule to 7 times bigger. But crucially, oil molecules of even that size could slide through the throat of the pore. Papa called together his senior managers. These guys were all geared up for finding gas, he said. We had been successful beyond our wildest dreams. So it was a shock when Papa said that the price of gas was going to collapse and could be low for many years. He told the stunned managers that the company was going to stop looking for shale gas. Instead, they should start searching for shale oil. The room was silent. Papa braced for a pushback. There could have been a rebellion. They could have said, Mark, you're out of your mind. But instead they said, okay, Mark, we'll do that. Yet Papa was in a hurry to advertise the change publicly, and not only afterwards he went to an investors conference in New York City and listened to as the other CEOs all talked about how much gas they had discovered and how much more they would find. Papa thought to himself, those guys are ignoring Economics 101. For his part, he was deliberately vague in public about EOG's new thinking. But inside EOG, it was different. We went 180 degrees in the other direction looking for oil, said Papa. EOG ended up focused on the Eagle Ford Shale, which underlies South Texas, and the Eagle Ford was regarded as the source rock, the kitchen, for other Texas oil fields, but it was considered to have little commercial potential of its own. Yet in their research, the EOG geologists came across seismic logs from very low production wells called strippers that had been drilled decades ago. As they examined the logs, they became more and more excited. The production profiles of those old wells matched up with how shale well performed. High initial production, then declining to steady production at a much lower level. And the play, said Papa, was beginning for horizontal drilling. The geologists and petroleum engineers at EOG suddenly visualized something that could not have previously been imagined. 120 miles of pure oil. Papa sent out orders to lease as much land as possible, but also as quietly as possible. By the time they were done, EOG's landsmen had acquired 500,000 acres at $400 an acre, and EOG thought it had acquired almost 1 billion barrels of oil. But as it began to drill, it found that it had greatly underestimated the reserves. Papa broke the news at the investment conference in 2010. We believe horizontal oil from unconventional rock will be a North American industry game changer, he said. Once it became apparent that EOG had done, other companies rushed into the Eagle Ford. The land price shot up from the EOG's $400 an acre to $53,000. By 2014, EOG had become the largest onshore crude oil producer in the United States. Within a couple of years, it would become clear that Papa had understated shale oil. It was not only a North American game changer, it would be a global game changer. Then there was North Dakota. After decades of dry holes across the state, oil had first been discovered in 1951 in the Williston Basin by a company called Amerada, which later became part of Hess Corporation. The resulting boom led to a Time magazine cover story that described the state as an El Dorado for future oil production. A monument dedicated in 1953 at the site of the Amerada discovery said it opened a new era for North Dakota. But it turned out that there was no El Dorado and no new era. Despite a lot of drilling, not much oil was found, and the boom petered out. Nevertheless, Amerada and later Hess stayed in the state, adding to its acreage. We kept finding other geologic horizons, and that kept us at the table, said John Hess, CEO of Hess. We thought that changes in technology would enable us to get more oil out. We held on because we continue to believe in it. There is an old story in the oil business. If you have an oil province where you have multiple shots, that's something you want to keep. A few others also suspected that significant oil could be found in North Dakota. That included an Oklahoman named Harold Hamm. He was an oilman to his core. The oil business grabbed my mind and my young imagination. He said, I wanted to find oil. Hamm had grown up dirty poor, one of 13 children of an Oklahoma sharecropper. As a child, he would help his family put cotton bolls. Because the harvest season extended beyond the opening of the school year, he would often be months late joining his grades and would have worked hard to catch up. Instead of going to college, he went to work around oil fields. In the beginning, his main skills were his work ethic, his intelligence, and the fierce drive to succeed. He was, as he described himself years later, a hungry young man. One of his jobs was hauling diesel and lubricating oil to drilling sites, which is how he met oilmen. He talked to them about the business and was tutored by them on how to read maps and logs and how to drill and complete wells. At age 25 in 1971, he scrapped together the money to acquire rights to an oil field that a company was selling off. He had different views of its prospects. I had in the business for 5 years, and he said, and I had a very strong conviction. He hit oil. He was launched. He also recognized that he had to catch up. He spent his evenings poring over books on geology and geophysics and took courses when he could at the local college. I didn't go for the degree, but for the education, he said. He sold his first company in 1982. He started a drilling company. He also had his failures, including drilling 17 dry holes in a row. But he persevered and built up a company that he named Continental Resources. In the mid-1980s, he started looking for oil in the Williston Basin that straddles Montana and North Dakota. Continental discovered 2 fields on the Montana side using horizontal drilling. In 2003, Continental started acquiring acreage of the North Dakota side of the basin. The shale revolution in natural gas was just getting going. Could this technology be applied in North Dakota? At a depth of 2 miles, sandwiched between a number of other strata, was a formation called the Bakken, named for a local farmer. and just below in the Three Forks, though technically categorized as tight sands, these are similar to shale and are usually called shale. Until the shale revolution, they were skipped over to no value, and people thought you could never produce from the Bakken, said John Hess. But what was happening in the Barnett in Texas suggested otherwise. The answer in terms of technology was horizontal drilling in the form of stages, rather than trying to frack the length of the entire horizontal well all at once. The drillers would do so in stages, learning and experimenting and adjusting to the specific rock as they went. Doing this in stages 2 miles underground along a 2-mile horizontal track took more time and cost more, but it could work. And by 2009, it was working. The Bakken took off. In 2004, North Dakota had produced a grand total of 85,000 barrels per day. By 2011, it had more than quadrupled the 419,000 barrels to 419,000 barrels. North Dakota overtook California as the third largest oil-producing state in the country, and then Alaska as the second largest, behind only Texas. And by 2014, North Dakota was producing 1.1 million barrels per day, a 14-fold increase from a decade earlier. It turned out that Time magazine was absolutely right in predicting an El Dorado in the North Dakota. It had just been 60 years too early. The oil boom in North Dakota gave a great boost to the state's economy and to state government revenues. Economic growth surged, and so did incomes. Farmers operating on the margin, but who owned mineral rights, had an infusion of money. During the post-2008 years of high unemployment in the United States, North Dakota had the lowest rate, and the out-of-work migrated into the state. But the rapidity and scale of the boom created its own problems: a shortage of housing and overcrowded roads, schools, hospitals, and even courts. Also, North Dakota was not sufficiently connected to pipelines, and that meant that large volumes of oil had to move by rail in trains with as many as 100 cars. The amount of oil transported by rail in the United States went from 50,000 barrels per day in 2010 to more than 1 million in 2014. That business was much welcomed by railroads, whose coal hauling business was in decline. One of the most unusual challenges in the Bakken turned out to be the birds. The U.S. Department of Justice, acting on a complaint from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, brought a criminal indictment, a written charge of crime, against Continental, the company, and 2 other oil companies for the death of 28 migratory birds. In Continental's case, the entire death toll totaled 1 bird of a species known as Sais fib, which the Cornell University Lab of Ornithology described as common around people, often nesting on buildings. By comparison, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, 500,000 birds a year are killed by wind farms, 60 million birds a year by cars, and 100 million by flying into windows. A federal judge finally threw out the case in 2012, saying a conviction would criminalize many everyday activities, including trimming and cutting trees, harvesting crops, driving a car, and owning a cat, estimated to be responsible for up to 3.7 billion bird deaths a year in the United States. After the Bakken and the Eagle Ford came the Permian, the biggest of all. The Permian Basin sprawls across 75,000 square miles in the West Texas down into southeastern New Mexico. Much of it is characterized as a featureless high plain. It draws its name from rocks that are characteristic of a Permian geologic age, which ended with the Great Extinction that wiped out most living creatures about 250 million years ago. The name itself was derived from the Russian city of Perm, where in the 19th century a British geologist had identified rocks of that geologic area. At the beginning of the 20th century, the parched Permian region was dismissed as a petroleum graveyard. In 1920, the Permian was said to have little so recommended as a potential oil province. The first successful well came in 1923 on lands the state had endowed to the University of Texas, the Santa Rita I, named for the patron saint of the impossible, but subsequent wells were disappointing. Then, in October 1926, on the lease that had almost expired, a discovery opened up the Permian as a great oil province. The Permian would also become one of America's most important assets during World War II, as its production literally doubled to meet the wartime need for fuel. After the war, the Permian boomed yet again. The region and its oil business became a magnet for young men seeking their chance. Among them, a Navy veteran and Yale University graduate, George W. Bush, who moved there with his wife Barbara and baby George. Every day the independents were rolling the dice. If I hit, Bush said at the time, there was money to be made. If I didn't hit, it's my hard luck. And in 1974, the basin, really a collection of several different giant oil fields, reached its peak, providing almost a quarter of total U.S. oil supplies. By thereafter, output in the Permian began a precipitous decline, hitting a low point in 2007. The patron saint of the impossible was no longer there to help out, and many were the last heights set over the region. The role of the Permian Basin as a major oil-producing province thus appears to be past, wrote one geologist in 2006, and its future can thus be only one of continued decline. Yet by then, rising oil prices were starting to stimulate renewed activity in the Permian. The number of drilling rigs increased, and by 2011, it was getting harder to find a free table at the Wall Street Bar and Grill, a favorite eatery for oil people in the Midland. But the new drilling was still the traditional vertical wells. In January 2011 marked the beginning of the Arab Spring, which brought tumult to the Middle East and North Africa, and much uncertainty about the region's future. That same month, the title of a new report announced that the U.S. petroleum industry was changing. The shale gale goes oily. The main case study was the Bakken, but it also called attention to a potential mega shift that operators are taking a second look in their own backyard in order to ascertain whether the new technologies could be applied in existing fields that were considered past their prime, and the biggest backyard was the Permian Basin. In November 2011, the board members of Pioneer, a large independent, gathered in their conference room in Dallas to hear a 3-hour presentation by the company's geologists, and Pioneer's fortunes had mirrored the industries. It had ventured into the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico and internationally, developing projects in countries ranging from Argentina to Equatorial Guinea. In 2005, it decided to begin to sell off its international projects and come home. The political arena and cost structure in our various assets outside of the lower 48 onshore in the United States were becoming too risky, said CEO Scott Sheffield. They could also see the success that other companies were having in the Barnett Shale, and better to plow money back into the United States, where contracts were generally observed and courts independent, than deal with foreign governments that could unilaterally change the terms under which a company operated. For 2 years, Pioneer's geologists had studied the shales under Pioneer's 900,000 acres in the Permian, and their conclusion was startling. Under it lay a potential bonanza, not just one layer of shale, but layer upon layer of tight rocks stacked on top of each other like pancakes a mile or two beneath the surface, whose oil could be made to flow in abundant volumes with hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. That, said Sheffield, was the aha moment. Pioneer abruptly redirected its spending to that resource. In 2012, it drilled its first successful horizontal shale well in the Permian. Pioneer was only one of the host of companies that jumped on the new opportunity. Once again, the region was booming. The shortage now was not of oil, but of workers and housing and office spaces. Plans were made for a 53-story office building in Midland that would be the tallest skyscraper between Houston and Los Angeles. Production skyrocketed, and by 2014, Permian output zoomed from the low point of 850,000 barrels in 2007 to 2 million, almost 25% of total U.S. crude oil output. Altogether, in a very short time, the new technology transformed Texas, putting it on an extraordinary growth path. Between January 2009 and December 2014, the state's total crude oil output more than tripled. By this time, Texas was producing more oil than Mexico and more than every OPEC country except Saudi Arabia and Iraq. The unconventional revolution also transformed the map of oil resources. One area is the Permian. In the Permian, known as Spraberry and Wolfcamp, was now deemed the second largest oil field in the world, behind only Gwahar in Saudi Arabia, supergiant field. The Eagle Ford was ranked fifth behind Burgan in Kuwait and another Saudi field, and ahead of the giant Samut Lower field that is a foundation of Russia's oil might. The United States was back, once again, a major player in the world. E aqui termina então o capítulo 2.